Welcome to the session. What we're going to be looking at today is quite a few things, hopefully that you'll find interesting, varied, exciting. Might not be the right word, but perhaps. What we're going to be looking at is Dynamics 365 in the cloud. And the reason we decided to put this session together is because a lot of organizations, a lot of people over the last couple of years have decided to migrate the version of Dynamics. And we're speaking mostly about Dynamics CRM today. But move a copy of Dynamics into the cloud. And that in itself is a bit of an undertaking. And for a lot of people, that becomes a means to an end. That's the end in itself. And one of the questions we often get from people is, okay, so now it's in the cloud, what else can we do with it? We know the data's perhaps saved somewhere else. We've heard about the Power Platform. We're using Teams, especially these days. Is there any way that these things can come together? Is there any point in being in the cloud, in short, other than just being there because that's what Microsoft wants us all to do? And that's what this session is all about. So we're going to talk a little bit about Dynamics 365 itself, how the landscape is changing, sort of the new features, a little bit around that, and how the app-based model works within Dynamics. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Teams. Teams is something I guess has become kind of indispensable where you work, if you're anything like us and the people we're working with over the last 9 months especially. But beyond just being able to have meetings about going into the office, Teams has got many other capabilities, and one of which is how it works with Dynamics. There are various levels you can work with it in Dynamics, which we'll come to later on. But one of those, which we'll call out a little bit today, is the Dynamics chatbot. Which you can easily deploy and could become indispensable, especially if you're a mobile user as well. Excuse me. Then we're going to talk about the Power Platform itself. For those of you not aware of the phrase Power Platform, it is Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, and Power Virtual Agents. So we're going to talk about what those are, and what they do, and how they work with Dynamics. Centered as part of that, though, is going to be conversations around the common data service. So the common data service is a centralized location for your data. That is where your Dynamics data is. This is where all the entities are stored. But now that it's there, then it's hyper connected to all these different things. So we'll talk about that just a little bit. Everybody likes automation, especially when it comes to doing tasks in Dynamics. So we'll have a conversation around that. We'll talk a little bit about Power BI, some of the integrated functionality that you get with Power BI and Dynamics, but also how you can then extend it and what else you can do. That doesn't seem immediately obvious, doesn't jump off the page straight away. And of course, we're going to talk a little bit about Power Apps. The idea behind Power Apps, and again, I'll come on to this in more detail later on, is that organizations are able to build their own applications, whether for computers, tablets, mobile phones, whatever. And you can connect to Dynamics or Dynamics type data very quickly and easily, and quickly spin up apps for people to use, which deliver experiences for them. What I can also do, though, that leads on to the next point, is what that can do is if you start reimagining how you've been using Dynamics and rethinking about what Dynamics is actually for, it may be that you can take some of the services out of Dynamics, bring them into Power Apps, and as you'll see later on, I can translate into significant license savings. So it's something to keep an eye out for. And then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about the future. One of the big moves Microsoft are making at the moment, and has been especially so in the last 12 months and will be for the next 5 years or so, is around artificial intelligence. And Dynamics is no different. So we'll talk about how that can be introduced as well. And then by the end, we'll have some time, hopefully, for some questions. If you do have any questions as the session goes on, please do keep them to the end, just because we've got a lot to get through today. Jot them down. It may even be that we cover it as we go through, but we should have time at the end for some questions. If we don't get through all of your questions at the end, my contact details are going to be shown at the end, so you can get in touch and ask me direct as well. Okay. So I said at the beginning, I'm Simon. I didn't give myself a proper introduction or to the company that I'm working for. So my name's Simon Carter. I am the Power Platform lead here at Pi Digital. Pi Digital is a digital agency with over 50 years experience of transforming businesses and doing digital transformations. I work with organizations of all different sizes on the challenges that you face when you do things like move into the cloud or introduce new software or rethink how you're going to be working. Helping organizations get in line with Microsoft's strategy, which is a good position to be for a lot of people. One of the things we've been working a lot with recently is, as I said at the beginning of this, the Dynamics 365 and what else can it do? How does it work with Power Platform? How does it work with Teams and all of that? The great thing about this, and one of the points we tried to call out here, is that this is all mostly using technology that you already have. In your Office 365, Microsoft 365 subscription, you will have not just Dynamics, you've already got Teams, you've already got SharePoint, you've already got the Power Platform. This is stuff that you'll likely not only already have, but are probably licensed to use, but you're just not using it. So one of the things we do work with organizations, and it's the same with Office 365 in general, is we're here, we're in the cloud, what next? And this is where I come in a little bit. My role is mostly focused around the Power Platform, which, as I said before, is Power Apps, Power Automate, and all of that. I have an Office 365 background, so one of the things I am really passionate about is how people can get the best out of the tools that are available to you, how to cut through the fog of the 20, 30 applications you've got in Microsoft 365 to get through to what it is that you actually want to do, what you want each user to do. And this session today is going to go some way towards that. How we help the different organizations. Some of the typical things that we do is to help develop a digital and data strategy. We look at three things. We look at the short term, the medium term, and the long term. So by the short term, some of the things you'll see today are really quick wins that you can introduce now, that you can start introducing to your staff, that people can see real benefits from. And that's your short-term wins and your short-term strategy. But one of the things we always encourage is thinking for the medium and long term. With the cloud first strategy that Microsoft have implemented, they're saying this is the last platform you will ever need. We're just going to keep upgrading this platform. So you need to be ready for that. You need to be ready and agile for the changes that are going to come into the future. So part of your medium-term strategy may be, okay, we're not going to have the LinkedIn connector now. We're not going to do Power Apps today, but we do want to do that next year. So you want to get ready for it now. Things that you do now, if you're just migrating now, for instance, make sure that you set things up in the right way so that it's easy to extend, easy to build on, and you can start realizing benefits now, and you set up for future success as well. Some of the things we do, I'll just touch on them briefly, are migrations and upgrades. Sometimes that goes hand in hand. SharePoint migration would be a good example. A Dynamics migration is a really pertinent example, obviously, today, where you're not just migrating data, you're not just going into the cloud, you're also upgrading at the same time. And with that comes its own issues, challenges, not necessarily issues, but with staff engagement, training, onboarding, implementation, different workshops on what people actually want, user groups, and starting to rethink your current setup. Because every migration, every move is an opportunity, isn't it? Not just to lift and shift everything you've already got, but start to rethink everything. And that's what I mean when we say about providing specialist advice in helping organizations free from the siloed systems. So Dynamics on-premise is a really good example of that. The data is locked away. Dynamics is locked away. Yeah, it connects to Outlook, but it's not really hyper connected, is it? Whereas when you get into the cloud, as you'll see in a few minutes, you've got all of these opportunities. It's not a silo anymore. It's part of, and it's not my favorite word, but it's part of the ecosystem, as Microsoft would describe it. And that's what we're going to talk about today with Dynamics and the Microsoft ecosystem. So first of all, a little bit about the landscape as it is at the minute. As I said to you before, Dynamics 365 on-premise, or any version of Dynamics on-premise, same as a SharePoint on-premise installation, kind of exists in its own bubble. It's possible to connect to the data. It's possible to do various things with the application, but to all intents and purposes, it's on its own. If you want the data from it a lot of the time, you can use export and things like that, but it's not really connected. In the cloud, it's part of a wider thing. We're all used to Office 365. Microsoft now like to brand everything on there as Microsoft 365, which makes sense. The way we see that is that Dynamics is part of that Office 365. So, you know, your SharePoint, Teams, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all of that is all part of Office 365. And that's part of the wider ecosystem or the landscape. You've also got Azure, which does various different things. A couple of things just to call out now. The Azure Active Directory is where all of the person data is stored in Microsoft 365. That's where your user identity is stored in Microsoft 365. It's also possible to store data, create databases, etc. in Azure. But it's a really key component. It's the key component to Office 365. Beneath that, we've got a layer on the Power Platform. We haven't got Power Virtual Agents in here, because it's still technically in preview. Power Virtual Agents, I'll mention it now because it won't come up again today. But for those of you who aren't aware, they are chatbots that you can build and publish on the web. But what you can do with a virtual agent, just briefly, is you can have it so that somebody can ask a certain question and then it can trigger a workflow, or it can open an app, or it can send some data for a report, or it could do something in Dynamics. So Power Virtual Agents is one of the next big things as part of the Power Platform. I won't spend any longer talking about the applications in there because it's going to come up as we go through today. But how that all works is, as you can see beneath, first of all, your connectors. Now the connectors are what actually makes all this worthwhile. You can, well, the lines on this table, this diagram, the connectors, but the connectors are how you get data from one place and put it in another, or analyze it here, or do something with it there. And the great thing about Microsoft now, I sound like I'm banging a drum for Microsoft at the minute. I am a little bit, but one of the great things about what they're doing at the minute is they've moved away from the walled garden of everything has to be Microsoft. So if you want to do something with an email, it has to be Outlook. If you want to do something to do with project management, it has to be Project or Planner. They've accepted that people use Microsoft 365, but also use other systems. It's the same as in your personal life. Just because you have Facebook, it doesn't mean you don't have Twitter. And there's more acceptance to that from Microsoft now. So the data connectors can connect to almost anything that you can think of, even connects to Salesforce, which of course is a direct rival to Dynamics CRM. On the right-hand side, just skipping the AI Builder for now, we've got the Common Data Service. As this is where all of your Dynamics data is, but it isn't just for Dynamics. You can use it for a data source for all of your Power Apps. You can store data in there that's going to be analyzed by Power BI. So the Common Data Service it's going to be renamed soon, I think, to Oakland or something like that. But the Common Data Service is a central data location for your company's data that you can then leverage and use throughout all of the different applications. And then just in the middle there, we've got the AI Builder. This is the direction Microsoft are going in. And part of the reason for that is, first of all, because the technology is now there, it's more mature. The second thing is because companies now of all sizes, even smaller companies, have so much data now that's stored. You've got years worth of digital data. It's all over the place. It could be fragmented. You start bringing it together into the CDS or something similar. And what the AI models can do is then work with that to, whether it's spot trends, whether it's to do sentiment analysis on your interactions with your customers, whether it's to, you may all get the Cortana daily briefing, which tells you what you've got coming up today. That's part of the AI thing, where it's looking at your emails and saying these are the tasks that you have. The AI Builder itself allows you to build your own AI models, to do your own things in there as well. And it's kind of hand in hand with Power Automate in that sense. It's not something we're going to delve into deeply today, just because of time, but it's something that's very interesting for the future. So what that means is, excuse me, across Microsoft 365, is there is no silo anymore. You might be somebody who only ever works in two of these things or one of these things, but it doesn't matter because it isn't just an application on its own. You're not just working on your own. What you have is all of these different applications. They're all linked together. The thread that does bring them all together is you, your user identity. You have the same identity in each of these, of course, and in many places with Microsoft 365 groups. So groups, for instance, drive teams. You know, if you're in a team, that's part of a group. Most SharePoint sites these days are going to be part of groups, because every time you create a group, you get a SharePoint site, you get a planner, you get the opportunity to build a workspace with Power BI. So bringing this all together, it feels more like one ecosystem. But the smart thing here is that using something like Dynamics, you can then pick and choose which parts of the rest of Microsoft 365 you do want to interact with. It could be Forms. We're not going to talk about Forms today, but Forms is a survey builder. in Office 365. So you could, using Power Automate to link them together, you could use forms. So when somebody fills in a form, it does something in Dynamics. So it could be for leads, opportunities, something like that. That, of course, could then be analyzed in Power BI. Somebody creating a form could then add something in Dynamics and then create a task in Planner. So you can start to see how you can pick these things together. And of course, then you would email, post a message in Teams, all that sort of stuff. Very quickly, these things become connected and essential. But for each task, the point is that you can use any of these things, any combination of these things to achieve what it is that you want to do. We talked about it a couple of times, but what drives all of this? So as I said, you as the user and the groups, they tie it together. But what drives all of this is the data in the middle. So when we talk about Office 365, that's slightly separate. You know, it's applications, things like email, SharePoint, Word, and so on. But as we move into the Dynamics and the Power Platform area, what we're really talking about is the data in a common data service. And as I said to you at the beginning, that's kind of a thread that's going to be taking us all the way through this session today, because it's so key to how this is working. Now, the good news is you've got Dynamics 365 in the cloud. Your data is already in the CDS. So you're there. The question is then, what else are you can do with it? And the good thing is, instead of the data being just tied to Dynamics as it is when it's on premise, it's now there. It's hyper accessible. Of course, there's security and so on. That can be driven by groups or individual security roles still. But the data is there and it's accessible for the people who need it when they need it. So a couple of examples, the obvious ones, you can connect Power BI to the data. You can get real-time reports. You can use Power Automate, and something in Dynamics can trigger something. You know, a new entity has been created, or something, a record has been added to an entity. So that triggers a set of actions using Power Automate. It could be that data was collected using Power Apps or something like that. We've also got AI still, of course, which could be doing stuff in the background, providing you with information. So it's really important to start thinking of it as an opportunity. This centralized data is an opportunity to start rethinking about how you use everything within the Power Platform or Dynamics space. So how do we get that data and what can we do with it? Well, first of all, there is user-driven input. So the most obvious one when we talk about Dynamics is people actually going into Dynamics and adding data through Dynamics 365. That's adding data. Could also be, however, that somebody's using a Power App to complete some data that's then being stored in the CDS, that's then used for something else. It can be retrieved by the app, it can be worked on by the app, but the data collection itself can also be done via Power Apps. Third of all, those of you who are long-term Dynamics users will know, of course, about Outlook with emails, attachments, and the Outlook plugin, which will capture information. And where you store that is kind of up to you. With the email attachments, for instance, you could store them in SharePoint, which might be more cost effective. But the actual data from the emails, etc., that's data input that can be captured into the CDS, into Dynamics. Then there's automation. Now, a couple of these things are add-ons. So remember at the beginning, I said to you that this is all using stuff that you already have, but there are a couple of things where that might not be the case. So for instance, the LinkedIn input here, it'd be automated, but it's an add-on to Dynamics. It's not something you automatically have. The great news about it is if you decided you were going to go for it, it's a quick switch on and plug in. It's really, because Microsoft obviously now on LinkedIn, they've really worked to put these things together quickly. And the automated input here is an example of which would be working with your contacts. So you have a contact who's a CEO at a certain organization, they then move. And without actually going and checking on that person's record, you wouldn't necessarily know that that's happened. With the LinkedIn connector, it grabs that, it updates your contacts, it can notify people that this has happened as well. So this is, like I say, more automated input. Going on from there, we've got Power Automate, which I mentioned a few times. This could be, Power Automate is event driven normally. You can trigger a workflow by clicking a certain button or clicking a link or taking a certain action, but these are all events. So this thing happens, a chain of actions kicks off, and then the end result is that you've got data in Dynamics, or somebody sent an email, or something's been updated. But the key thing is here, it's all happened automatically. And this is where you can, this is one of the quick wins I was talking about, identifying areas in your organization where not just in Dynamics, but in the whole of Microsoft 365, where there are user-driven tasks that have a lot of commonalities in them. These are the things you then turn into workflows in Power Automate. And then it may be that there's a slight bit of user input, so an approval, for instance, somebody has to approve that this happens. But for the most part, it can zoom through in seconds, which would take people hours, perhaps days. Another add-on is Insights down at the bottom there. Insights is something you can get for Dynamics. You may have actually seen it in Outlook because it comes as part of your personal insights. You've got a meeting, these are the documents you might like, that sort of thing. With Dynamics, from a CRM perspective especially, it's more than that. What it does is it helps you spot trends based on previous history, so it learns how you interact with your customers, how they've interacted with you, how that then went, what the outcome was, and then predicts outcomes for the future. What it can also do is analyze sentiment. So in between email conversations, for instance, it can give you a sentiment score based on how that conversation is going, just so you can see if it's starting to go off a little bit. And as I say, the key thing from AI and what Microsoft are trying to really do is to help people work and predict the future a little bit. Obviously, these are uncertain times when all over the place, but when it comes to your business and how you're working with your customers, one of the key things, obviously, is how things have gone before, how your business tends to work, and it can help you make small changes with certain customers, or it can make you have you make huge changes in your organization, how you deal with things. So it could potentially be a game changer for you. And that's input. The other half of that, of course, is then using the data. It isn't there for no reason. Obviously, you don't just collect it for a collection's sake. So what are you going to do with it? Well, the first thing is, and we're going to talk about Power BI in just a few minutes, using something like Power BI to start analyzing the data. And at first, it can be daunting. As I said a few minutes ago, one of the things that Microsoft realizes that everybody now has absolutely masses of data, whether it's just, you've got 10,000 emails sat there, or you've got all these different activities or issues or anything in there. It's a lot of data around each customer. So using something like Power BI helps you drill down to what it is you actually want to know. And one of the ways it does this is you can just ask it questions, plain English questions. You can just type in, how's it going with, etc. And it will give you full reports. It will give you the data back that you need. And within seconds as well. We're going to see Teams in just a second, how Teams can work with Dynamics. I think Teams is more of a two-way street. It isn't just using the data and seeing the data and seeing the files, etc. It is also possible to have tabs in Teams for your Dynamics input, so people can actually input data via Teams as well. And then we've got SharePoint. I think everybody has SharePoint. It's one of those things that's around. Microsoft did have a bit of an identity crisis with SharePoint over the years, trying to make it do everything. And now they're using it as what it is. One of the best document management systems you can get with world-class security, governance, etc. And you'll see in just a few minutes how that can work with your documents for Dynamics. Okay, first of all, though, a little bit about SharePoint background before we talk about Teams. So as I said, SharePoint had a bit of an identity crisis. Anybody who used SharePoint, say 2013, for instance, you may still have it. And one of the things with SharePoint was that Microsoft wanted it to do everything. It was Microsoft's answer to be the centralization for production, communication, and all that sort of thing. They now, of course, as you'd be well aware, have decided that Teams is doing that instead. And I tend to agree. There's so many more things in SharePoint could. The user experience is better, etc. But now what it allows you to do with SharePoint is just really experience what it is good at. It's good at now creating web pages, attractive web pages. The amount of organizations who are now actually happy to be using SharePoint as their intranet is growing daily because communication sites, etc. The amount of things you can do with it is brilliant. Speaking about the pages themselves, you can embed Power Apps, you can embed Power BI reports, you can put in forms. So the data from Dynamics can actually be surfaced right there in SharePoint. But the key thing that it's for, and one of the reasons it's on here today is for you to start thinking more about how your documents are stored. So the chances are, I guess 99% of people are like this, your documents in Dynamics are stored in SharePoint. But also the chances are that it's just a default setup. So you've got your different document libraries for different customers or whatever, you just got the default setup. What it's possible to do now, and this will extend the usefulness of it all, and take you outside of Dynamics a little bit is that you can use Office 365 groups, Microsoft 365 groups. What this will allow you to do is say, let's use Contoso, Microsoft's favorite one. If they were a customer of yours, you have a group set up for them. You control the group membership as you do any group in Microsoft 365. And that instantly means that everything in that site and everything in that group is security controlled and available only to those people. And as you can see, just in the top right of that graphic there, it's only got 3 members that site, but it's instantly easy to see who can see all of the data. It's all transparent. Beyond SharePoint now, and beyond just keeping the documents there in SharePoint, or maybe the email attachments, what it allows you to then do is, just take a sip of water, excuse me. What it allows you to then do is take advantage of the other things you get with groups. So it isn't just SharePoint, it isn't just document storage, but when you set up a group, you also get a Teams presence where you can have a Teams presence. You also get Planner as well. So rather than, if you need to do something, rather than having, set up a project or something like that, you could quickly add things to Planner. That's accessible via the Planner app as well. So it means not everybody has to be licensed for Dynamics. For instance, look at activities in there. So it's just rethinking that a little bit and thinking, well, okay, not everybody wants to, or not everybody's able to, not everybody's licensed to go into Dynamics to get the information, the documents, the conversations, the tasks for this customer. So maybe we do something in Planner, maybe we do something in Teams. What you could also do as well using Power Automate is link those two things together. So you've got an activity in Dynamics that could be replicated in Planner for the people who just want an oversight of it rather than have to have a Dynamics license, know how to go into it, know where to look for it, and so on. But one of the key things is Microsoft Teams. And that is, for me, the big advantage you get with the groups. Okay, it's great that you can store the documents in a SharePoint site right for that customer, for instance, but with Teams, you actually get not just the productivity side of it, you get the communication, you get actual Dynamics interactivity as well. So what you can see on this screenshot here is a setup where there's a tab especially set up for some information from Dynamics. So you would have to be licensed for this tab in particular, but what you now get is, rather than having to go to Dynamics, open it, find a place, and for us guys here, that's straightforward. Many of you probably built the platform that people are using in your organization, so you know exactly where it is. It's quite intuitive, but it's not for everybody. And people who are familiar with using Teams, who just want quick information or quickly be able to input a bit of information, being able to just go into Teams, click on a tab, and there's the form that they need to fill in, is almost priceless. It's not intimidating. It's easy to do. And from your perspective, if you are the people who built it, or from the data perspective, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether they filled it in here or whether they went into Dynamics. It doesn't matter at all, because the data is still going to CDS. It's still doing what it needs to do. It's still kicking off any workflows that need to be kicked off. So it's working well. What you can also do in Teams, of course, is have conversations around that. Now, there is certain information you want to keep in Dynamics. So, from the email side of it, the more formal things. But what you're able to do in Teams is, those quick conversations, the kind of things you would have in a corridor with somebody if you bumped into them. That's especially relevant now, of course. I don't want to keep banging on about the pandemic, but in an area, most of us, where you can just bump into somebody in the corridor and have a quick chat about North America sales for Contoso in that case. It means that using Teams in this way is, again, it becomes invaluable, because you can have those corridor type conversations just there in Teams. Leave the more formal stuff for Dynamics, but it gives you an oversight of what's going on. Similarly, using Power Automate, you can post messages to Teams automatically. So if this happens with this customer, this person leaves this role, anything. If you've got insights and it spots an area of concern, you can have a post message to Teams. So again, you're bringing this, you're starting to see that this isn't necessarily for your core Dynamics users. This is for people outside of Dynamics. Could be for the senior management, could be for the exec, who just want to quickly see what's going on with your customers. And that's where Teams really comes into it. Added onto that is a Dynamics bot. The Dynamics bot, you can quickly deploy that to Teams. Like any bots work, try to book a holiday or something, or cancel a holiday. You go onto there, there's a little bot, you ask it some questions, it gives you some answers. Now, out of the box, you can have that. You can set it up today. You don't need any additional license or anything. What it does at the level at the basic level is just give you the information you could find in Dynamics yourself. So it's a kind of like a search, if you like, and it's giving you information about customers. But where it really comes into its own is when you do plug in insights to it. Use the artificial intelligence, because then the bot becomes intelligent. It's telling you things you couldn't necessarily find elsewhere. It has that information for you. So as I said, a Dynamics bot, it could be one of those quick wins. Setting up Microsoft groups and setting up teams, again, could be one of those quick wins we talked about at the beginning. But also setting it up in this way. I remember we talked about the medium-term strategy, the long-term strategy, where right now you're doing stuff that's going to set you up for success in the future. But if you decide that maybe we do want to go down the Office 365 groups model for storing our documents, for using Teams, etc., rather than just putting everything in one place, rather than just using Outlook, making everyone go into Dynamics, etc. And this is something you can do now. You can start to do now. You can start to set it up, and that means from then on, everybody's onboarded. They get that experience with Teams, even with a Dynamics bot. So that leads us on, talk about artificial intelligence and bots. That leads us on to the Power Platform. So how it all fits together is like this. I think actually we've talked about this a little bit, but just to go a little bit more in detail about it. So we've got Office 365. As we know what Office 365 is all of those applications we saw before. Beneath that, we've got Power Apps. On the left, we've got Power Automate. To the right, we've got Power BI, and they're surrounding a common data service. In Power Apps, you've got different types of applications you can build. So you've got model-driven apps. The model-driven apps are, if you started to build apps in Dynamics Online, these are model-driven apps. These are working on the data model. And although you don't get a lot of design capability, you can't make it really, really pixel perfect, bespoke, you can very quickly spin up apps that are connected, they're intelligent, that display the information to the user that they need to see. And you can do this in Dynamics, you can do this in Power Apps as well. With Canvas apps in Power Apps are where you get literally a blank canvas. So you get a white screen. It's not connected to any data. It hasn't got any drop downs, text boxes, nothing on the screen. It doesn't do anything. The Canvas app is where you get the opportunity to build something from scratch that looks exactly how you want it to look. It does exactly what you want it to do. And again, like with the model-driven apps, so the model-driven apps are based on a data model in the CDS. The Canvas apps can also connect to the CDS to add records, remove records, edit records, as well as connecting to all of those other things we talked about before. So connecting to Teams, connecting to Outlook, connecting to Salesforce, all of that sort of thing, Google Analytics, etc., etc. All can be done with Canvas apps. The difference between the two, as I say, with Canvas apps, you've just got full design control. And then you've got portals. Portals are slightly different, relatively new. If you think about portals, forget Canvas apps. A portal is something where your customers can go. See, it's essentially a website that you set up, and in there you can embed model-driven apps. You can build pages model-driven. So what this allows you to do is to open up your Power App Store basically to people who you work with, your third parties. So this is a new, like I say, it's a relatively new thing from Microsoft. It's an exciting area. It's one I think they're still saying is in preview, but it's like model apps, but it's external and more web-based. Then we've got the Common Data Service. When we've been talking so far about entities and records and so on, some of you may be familiar with that already. What we're really talking about is different tables within a big database with different items or records in there, the different fields, name, address, phone number for the basic level. With the Common Data Service, a good thing is you don't have to build it from scratch. It's already there. There's tons of stuff in there already. For instance, you've got a users entity, which has all of your staff in there. Everybody who uses Office 365 is in there. So you could use that to search for a user search or to email them or something like that. And there's all sorts of different ones for Dynamics, of course. Then you've got your custom entities. Custom entities are where, well, as it sounds, you build it yourself. So you have a specific use case of something. It could be for whatever. It could be for tracking meetings or something like that. So you want to have a custom entity that has, let's say, a meeting ID. When does it start? When does it end? All of that sort of thing. And like with any database, you can create relationships between them. So it could be that you have in your contacts list, you then use that as a lookup in your meetings list. So when you add in, you've got your form for your new meeting, and then you click on a drop down, and then it lists all of your contacts. So these things are all related together, and that's basically how the common data service works. Then, as you've already seen, you've got different connections to specific things within Office 365. So we've got Microsoft Outlook, the long-term partner of Dynamics, same with SharePoint as well. And as we've already discussed quite a bit, we've got Teams as well. Power Automate and Power BI fit together with this as much as Power Apps does in many ways. A few organizations have been running Power Automate for a couple of years without even looking at Power Apps or Power BI, because Power Automate is something, as soon as it was released, it was called Flow originally, so you might be more familiar with that. It was something that people could quickly work with. There was templates there. So a lot of organizations are running quite a lot on Power Automate. And as I said earlier on, it's quite a quick way of getting into the Power Platform, just to automate some tasks, just take the load off a little bit. We're going to talk more in focus now about the different things. So with Power Automate, I think I've touched on the most of the points in here as we've been talking about it, but I'll just go through a few of them now. So creating workflows in Power Automate it can get complicated, of course, but it can be relatively straightforward. What Microsoft have tried to do is to make this as drag and drop as possible. So you say you want a new action, it says, okay, so what you're going to use. You pick SharePoint, or you pick Outlook, or you pick Dynamics, or you pick CDS, or whatever. And then it says, okay, so you're picking that. What action do you want to do? Do you want to create a new record? Do you want to send an email? Do you want to create a calendar event? And you just build it up from there. Of course, as I say, it can get more complicated than that. You can run actions in parallel. You can put loops in. You can do approvals and all that sort of thing. But the key is, I would say here, is that it's very easy to get started with. My recommendation to you, if you're interested in it at all, you've never seen it, is to check out some of the templates. So the one that people always seem to install first of all, although it's not a necessary one, is the one where it says, if I get an email with an attachment, save that attachment to OneDrive. And you can set that up with no setup whatsoever, and it will just do it. Every time you get an email with an attachment, put that attachment in a folder called attachments in OneDrive. As I say, if you're thinking of doing that, it's not really necessary. It's one of the most popular ones. I think it's because it's so easy to understand. Almost any task that involves you interacting with Dynamics or any data can be automated. Unless you're there just for a discovery, trying to find things out from the data. When you're working and inputting data, quite often you then want to do some extra things. You've got tasks on the back of that. And we're not suggesting that every single part of every single process can be automated, although that would be great. But what we are saying is there's quite often elements of pretty much any task that can be automated, even if it's just sending an email at the end or a Teams notification or something like that. As we've said a couple of times, that Power Automate, like the rest of the Power Platform, can connect to the rest of Microsoft 365, but also outside of Microsoft as well. Each individual organization gets to choose. So if you're slightly concerned about what I'm saying here and think that are concerned that people are going to be posting things on Twitter automatically from Power Automate, yes, that's possible. But also you can turn that off. It can be turned off in the settings. It's about having a correct governance around that. There's some examples that you can do, post a message in Teams, send an email, update a record, create an activity, arrange a meeting, so on and so on and so on. You can also automate the updating group memberships. So if this happens, add this person to this group. If you remove a person from a group, do this. Make sure they're taken out of this security group or something like that. And the key thing is like I said, once it's set up, it just does it. Obviously, it's cheesy to say, but it never takes a day off. It's working all along. The amount of organizations we work with where like at 2 in the morning, they've got so many workflows kicking off just because nobody's online. So it can just get on and do the data transfer and remodeling and all that sorts of thing. So as I said, just to recap on Power Automate, it's something that's quite easy to get into. So if you are interested at all, obviously give us a call. But it is easy for you to have a quick look at it. Power Apps is slightly different. It isn't as pick up and play as Power Automate. With Power Apps, where you're building applications. And what we're talking about here, we're not going to go into how do you build applications, how does it all work, how do you put things together necessarily. But what we do want to call out is some of the benefits of doing it. The main one is thinking about the users in your organization. Rather than having 3 or 4 different things you can do in Dynamics that have a lot of stuff going on. Some things that people can use, some things that they can't. trying to make a bit of a one-size-fits-all because that's how Dynamics is set up. What you can now do with Power Apps is start thinking away from that. You know, you've got access to the data. It's in CDS. You've got Power Apps. You've got access to other parts of Office 365. So whatever it is you want the person to be able to do, you could probably build quite a bespoke application. We're not talking per user, obviously, but we're talking about groups of users where they can get a really focused user experience based on what it is that they need to do. And the good thing about it is, one of the great things about Power Apps and why it's took off in such a big way in the last couple of years is because you don't need developers necessarily. You don't need long lead times. You don't need people who are experts in code or anything like that, because technically there's no code in there. Microsoft used to call it that. They got in trouble because you have to write formulas, functions, and things like that, a little bit like with Excel. So now they call it low code. But what's great about it is that you can create it for any device. So you could create an app that does this with the data, that's for your phone, that quickly gives you some information. There's a Power BI report, a tile built in, so people can see it straight away. So you've got visualizations there as well. Collect a bit of data, collect a voice note, create an activity, set a meeting, whatever it is that you need to do, you can create these hyper-focused experiences for people. And as we touched on earlier on, it may be that it can also save the organization money as well, which is a bonus. The reason that we think this is a smart approach is that the simpler something is to use, it isn't just a case that it's more likely to be used because, you know, it's people's jobs, right? So however it was, they'd probably use it anyway, they have to. But the simpler you can make it to use, the more likely it is that it's going to be used correctly. And that's a real key thing. It's all very well having all this data, but if the apps are complicated, if the input method's complicated, if people don't know where to go and put things, you could get missing data, you could get fragmented data, you could get data loss, duplication, all of that sort of thing that you don't want. And that's what we mean about creating hyper-focused apps to let people do specific tasks. So again, we're not saying every single thing you need to do and every single user has to have their own app just for them. But for specific tasks or specific user groups, having an app that's just for them, does what they need to do, means they're going to do it well and they're going to do it quickly. On top of that, of course, Power Automate and Power BI are automatically connected. So you can have a button in Power Apps, somebody clicks it, it runs off and does an automation. Like I touched on just briefly with Power BI, it isn't just that the data you collect via Power Apps can be displayed in Power BI. Of course it can, but you can also display a Power BI tile. So that's like one visualization, but you can show that in Power Apps as well. So it's kind of full circle. So what that does is just makes it's just about thinking about things differently. This is the most basic example you can come up with, but say we had 10 applications that we used to have in Dynamics when it was on premise, and it had to be like that because that's where everything was taking place. Well, now you're moving into the cloud, and now you're in the cloud, you start to rethink that, and you think, well, you know, a few of these things are not really Dynamics-y functions. You know, it could be that you are using CRM and you've got it to do other things that aren't necessarily to do with CRM. And the reason you did it in there was because that's where to do it. So the reason a lot of people built SharePoint applications, because that was a platform that you have or had to do this. By rethinking it now, you think, well, no, we could take that out, which clears up this form in Dynamics. It helps these Dynamics users. But it also means now we're in Power Apps. So this helps these users to have their own app in Power Apps that does this thing. It stores the data in the CDS, but it's not clustering up Dynamics. It wasn't a Dynamics function in the first place. It's just now in the right place. And as we're going to touch on in 5 minutes or so, this can also help with your licensing costs too, because rather than having to license everybody then to use Dynamics, when they weren't doing Dynamics-y type functions, they weren't doing CRM stuff, you can license them to use Power Apps, and that can be a lot more cost effective. With Power BI, we talked about Power BI a few times as we've gone through. One of the things about it is that, of course, because it's Microsoft's product and it's part of the Power Platform, it's hyper connected and very quickly can be connected up to your data. With the data, you can connect directly to the CDS. You can either have real-time analytics, depending on if that's what you require, or refreshes. It all depends on your requirements, and it can change on a report by report basis. You can have a report for this, which needs to be in real time because this is really important to be bang up to date. Or you could have a different report that runs daily, or one that runs weekly, or one that runs quarterly even. Refreshes quarterly so people can see it. As I say, it just depends, and it can change each time. The dashboards in Power BI as well that people create, you can see some of the visualizations on there. They're not always pretty as this, of course. This is a nice example. But the key thing isn't how pretty it is, it's how quickly you get the information, how correct the information is. One of the great things about Power BI has always been, it's been around 5 years or so now. They've always had, as well as the visualizations you can have within the app, there's always been this huge community of people building their own visualizations, which then Microsoft hosts, and you can use those as well. So you're not constrained by the options you have within the app. But the great thing is you can do it very quickly. You can open an app, connect to some data, drag something onto the screen. It says, what are the values? What's the legend? What colors do you want it? All that sort of thing. And within minutes, you can have some information displayed on the screen. Of course, like with Power Automate, it can get more complicated. So it could be that you want to create quite a complex data model. So you want a little bit of data from here, a little bit from there, a little bit from there. You want some from an external source that isn't necessarily CDS related. But you can bring all these things together, create relationships in different areas. And then with that data, there's various different things you can do. The first one is it's easy to share it with people. You can embed it in a SharePoint web page. You can put it as a tab in Teams. You can surface it in Dynamics, or you can, as I've said a couple of times, put it into Power Apps. You also, as well, you can collaborate on this. Office 365, of course, is all about collaboration. You can collaborate on what you're building with your colleagues as well. So you can make a start, they can help you out. You can work through problems together. So it could be quite a good project. A lot of people have built dashboards as teams to display all their information. And then what it allows you to do is, we talked about trend analysis, etc., and future prediction with insights and artificial intelligence before. But of course, your organization, your data, so you can use these dashboards to do your own trend analysis. That's kind of the point of it, right? So you can see what's going on. And then you can make decisions, big decisions, small decisions, based on the actual data in front of you. So with Power BI, as I said, with Power BI, you essentially get self-service analytics. So you get data that's personalized to you or your role. You don't need to log into Dynamics because the data is brought in to Power BI. Even if you've got the real-time analytics in, it's bringing it in. One of the cool things has always been that you can ask questions in plain English. So you've got that search box up at the top, or you just type away any question about any customer, about any data, and it'll give it back to you. You can actually speak into it as well. So this is great for the mobile app. You've got a meeting with a customer in 5 minutes. You run in there. You want to know how it's going. You don't know where to look in your emails. You don't want to log into Dynamics. Great. You can just use the Power BI app and get the information there. And on top of that, you can have notifications, whether that's just notifications from the app, or whether that's Power Automate is set up to send a notification based on a certain amount of information. It could just be that this report has now been refreshed. When we start building talking about clever things, though, it could be, you've got this meeting with these people in 5 minutes, have a look at this report, all automatically. And this is where we start talking about Power Platform, artificial intelligence, automation, bringing it all together to get real benefits really quickly. And once you've started to have that sort of thing, you'll just wonder how you ever did without it. Rather than spend ages searching through emails and Dynamics, like I said, to find a bit of information, you can get reports that are just given to you. You don't have to ask for it; it's just there for you. So with some of the benefits and some of the things I wanted to just quickly talk about with the Power Platform is that some of the extra benefits is it allows you to, because you've got applications that are more focused, that are smaller. What it means is that you can have a more focused release model as well. So, and testing as well for those of you in development. So if you have a huge app that does lots of things, but you just want to change one small part of it, you can't just release it like that. You've got to do regression tests. You've got to make sure you haven't upset any other parts of the app. By having a more app-focused model where you've got split the apps out into different functions, it means if something goes wrong with this app, or you need to change this app or upgrade it, you do that, you push it out. It's not affected anything else. Security isn't an issue either. People are often concerned when we talk about the common data service. I think the word common there sounds like it's for everyone. The fact that it's a central location, the fact that we can create all these apps that can just connect to it. But security is sound. There is no, you can use security roles, you can use Microsoft 365 groups. The security is as you would expect. People should only be allowed to see what they're allowed to see. And it all comes down to governance and smart governance, as we talked about earlier on. There's no additional cost to maintain. In fact, as we were talking about before, the maintenance that cost can actually be reduced because you're actually focusing on the small part of it that needs attention. I won't read all of these because it's there on all of your screens, but improving the quality of the data, that's a really key thing. It's something we're always talking to people about, different companies. And that's because, as I touched on earlier on, the easier something is to use, the better the data quality. And it means that you don't have to worry about all of the GDPR things we were talking about before around duplication, fragmentation, etc. Because this is customers' data, this is people's data. So you need it to be collected properly, stored properly. And this is what this app-based model can do for you. And also, it does prevent Dynamics being seen as a solution for every different scenario. Those of you who work in a Dynamics production team have probably had this before, where somebody needs something that's kind of an appy sort of thing. So say, we could just build it in Dynamics, and it becomes another thing Dynamics is doing. So by having Power Apps and Power Automate and all of that at your disposal, it means that you can use the right tool for the right job. That's what it's all about, and that's part of Microsoft's strategy. As I said before, they've turned SharePoint into now what SharePoint should be in its websites, document storage, and so on. And it's the same with all of the different applications. The reason it looks so overwhelming when you've got 25 or so different apps is because they're taking the attitude that people have in the real world as well. If you open your phone right now, you've probably got 20, 30, 40 different apps on there at least, all for different things, but that never seems overwhelming. Because it isn't, because you've got one app that does this, you've got an app that does this, you've got an app that does this. And this is Microsoft's strategy, bringing that convenience and flexibility of the outside world into the work world. And you can join in with that as well by creating your own apps using Power Apps. So I'm going to briefly talk about licensing, a bit of a dry topic, but I've touched on it a couple of times. But what it really boils down to is how you license your users, or your staff, I should say. Because one thing that we have found is that over licensing is something that a lot of organizations have fallen foul of, and it isn't necessarily over licensing for what they have. You know, if you have 500 Dynamics users and they're all using Dynamics in various different ways, then they all need an enterprise license. Of course they do. But that's because of how you've been using Dynamics? Is it a case that some of what you've been using Dynamics for actually isn't a Dynamics function at all, and you could take it out and bring it into Power Apps? In which case, there's two different Power Apps models there. Just briefly, the Power App per app license gives a user a license to use 2 apps. It should be called Power Apps 2 apps license. And the Power Apps per user license allows them to use as many apps as they like. So again, it's user by user basis. And what's great about this, as a lot of Office 365, is that you're picking the right license for the right user. So as your business grows, then your licensing doesn't grow exponentially. It grows in line with what people are doing. If the business then realigns, then your licensing can realign. But going back to the example, you can see straight away that it's almost 10 times more expensive to run a customer service enterprise license than it is a Power Apps license. Now, you can't just take everything out of Dynamics and you can start building Power Apps, of course. You know, there's restricted entities, there's things you can do, there's things you can't do. But what is a clear use case that this isn't a Dynamics function? This should be a Power Apps. Then it just makes complete sense, not just from the user perspective, but from the organization's perspective, to think, well, for every user, we're going to save a tenth. It's going to cost us a tenth of what we're currently paying for it. So just to put this in a really clear example, in this organization, let's call it Contoso, you've got 500 different users. This is where we start off with. There's 10 different applications split evenly, let's say 50 each, and all using Dynamics apps. So the core price there, I know it differs depending on your agreements, but the core price, the list price there is 35,800 per month. However, if you then go and think, well, we can maybe split this. You can have 250 of your users doing Dynamics type stuff. You've got 250 of your users working in Power Apps. Now, I know this is a really simplistic illustration, but it is just that. It's to illustrate how different the cost is. And if it's just a case of this is in Dynamics because it always has been, well, first of all, like I say, the user isn't getting the experience that they should get. You're not getting the experience you should get. The data might not be as good as it could be, but also it's costing so much more. So of those 250 licenses in each one, the licensing for 365 costs nearly £18,000, where the Power App licensing costs less than £2,000 per month. So you can see that as long as you're doing it the right way and as long as it's appropriate, then this is really cost effective. This is, again, this could be part of your short-term strategy. Where can we save money instantly? 58. And I've mentioned it a couple of times, but one of the things I wanted to mention was insights. We've talked about it a few times. Artificial intelligence for your
Sorry, I think Simon's freezing just a tiny bit as we're kind of wrapping up towards the end. Simon, is it just your visual that's frozen, or also the audio too?
Dynamics chatbots. With chatbots, we mentioned it a few times before. This is the bot you can chuck into Teams. You can install in Teams, sorry, and you can ask questions of it. It can also run as its own app. So for your mobile users, they don't need to necessarily go into the desktop, get Teams and all that sort of thing. They can go straight into the app and then get all of the capabilities in there as well. And by using Insights, you get a really far upgraded version of the Dynamics chatbot than you would without it. Without it, it's still a great thing. Like I say, it's like a search. But excuse me. But with the insights as well, it's giving you information you didn't know you had before. I know we're almost out of time, and I think I may have briefly dropped off the call, so apologies for that if I did. But does anybody have any questions for the last couple of minutes? And I will also put my details on there. If anybody does want to send an email, my details are there, simon.carter@PiDigitalSolutions. You can email info@PiDigitalSolutions, or you can catch us on LinkedIn. I know some of you already connected with us, and you can follow us on Twitter as well. But yeah, I'd like to open the floor for any questions, please.